Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's international webcast with Schiller Institute founder and president Helga Zepp-LaRouche. It's clear that the geopoliticians have gone into a flight forward in the last days. They're reacting not to a military or economic threat from Russia and China, but from the collapse of their system. That's what they're reacting to. And we saw that very much in terms of the discussion process at the Munich Security Conference, which took place last weekend in Munich. There were warnings about Russia and China, and there was also a pushback from Foreign Minister Lavrov and from the Chinese. So Helga, why don't we start there to look at where things are going now?
Well, I think the Munich conference, which has been along these lines for a long time, but this time they were really hysterical, and the whole discussion naturally was dominated by the so-called 13 Russian spies, which Robert Mueller conveniently had discovered, which was actually an old hat, but he discovered it just in time for the Munich conference, and that dominated very much the discussion there in an anti-Russian hysteria, which is really taking on dimensions which are very, very dangerous. And, by the same token, the propaganda and hostilities against China are also on an unprecedented level. So in this context, if you actually read the speeches, which, people should do and not just take the press clips, I think that the two most interesting speeches were the one from Madame Fu Ying, who is a leading foreign policy spokesperson from China, who made a very calm, very good intervention by repeating that the aim of China is not to export its own model, but that China is just helping developing countries to accomplish their own development with their own model. And that China is motivated by building or trying to build a community of a shared future of mankind. And then if you listen to what Foreign Secretary or Foreign Minister Lavrov from Russia said, I thought this speech was very hard-hitting, because he made reference to the fact that the Munich Security Conference actually takes place in Munich, and that it is 80 years ago, where the Munich Agreement in 1938 agreed on the partition of Czechoslovakia, that was the prelude to World War II. And then he said that when it came to the Nuremberg trials and the main criminals of the Nazi period were put on trial, they actually said that the aim of all of this was to keep Russia out of Europe. Now, this is an obvious reminiscence of what is going on today. And if you look at the policies of the EU and NATO, how they try to push any influence of Russia away from the Balkans or Eastern Europe, then you actually see that that they have learned absolutely nothing from history, and that the danger of nuclear war is very high. And for example, the former NATO general and high-ranking Bundeswehr General Kujat warned of an accidental nuclear war. And so, I mean, the subject that, we could end up in war in all of this, at least some thinking people are extremely worried about this. And what Foreign Minister Lavrov also said, he, being in a German audience, he reminded people of the very constructive role the Soviet Union and then Russia had played in the process of the German unification, and that it was very clear at that time that a security architecture had to exist which would guarantee the security of both the East and the West. But what followed then was NATO expansion to the Russian border, which, by the way, documents have now proven that it was promised to the Russians at the time that this should not happen. So a clear violation of a commitment from that time. and that then he recalled the role of the EU in the Ukraine crisis, that it was actually the EU association agreement which was put to Yanukovych at the end of 2013, which forced him to make a choice between either the East or the West, which was triggering then the Maidan and the coup, of which he accused the EU of having, given that some support, which we know was the case, and also Victoria Nuland, who bragged, that the State Department paid actually 5 billion, anyway, a very large amount of money to support the NGOs and the color revolution and regime change in the Ukraine. So, in the end, he demanded a new security architecture, including Russia, China, the United States, and the EU. And I think that is a discussion which urgently must be put on the table, because we are on the brink of World War II, World War III, and such a new international security architecture is of the utmost urgency.
Well, it was 5 billion that Nuland said was spent on Ukraine, and the Ukraine situation is right now heading toward a very explosive potential, with Poroshenko just announcing that he agrees with the call from the parliament pushed through by the extreme right, the neo-Nazi grouping, for the Donbass reintegration plan. What is the danger here? I mean, it looks as though this is heading toward a new escalated confrontation.
Well, obviously, it means that the Minsk agreement or the Minsk process is practically dead. It can be revived, but as of now, if Poroshenko wants to have a military solution of reintegrating the Donbass, well, that threatens the immediate possibility of an all-out war with Russia. Now, this is extremely dangerous, and as we saw in the recent days and weeks, there were many neo-Nazi attacks on Russian institutions in Kiev, where the police was just standing by doing nothing. And then we have the incredible human rights violation of Natalia Vitrenko, who is the leader of the Progressive Socialist Party, who is one of the major opposition parties in Ukraine. And her request or her filing of trying to accommodate to the new rules of the Ukrainian government for party procedures was just rejected without any explanation. So Italian member of the European Parliament has just filed a request to the EU to answer, why are they not pursuing this case, given the fact that it's a clear violation of the EU rules, and we have to see what comes out of that. But I think the situation in the Ukraine could be, or is already becoming the worst, most dangerous hotspot in the world. And that all the more makes clear that a new relation, a new entente with Russia, as General Kuyat was demanding, is absolutely important if we want to keep world peace and the existence of civilization.
Well, just in the last few days, there were attacks by these neo-Nazi gangs on a Russian cultural center, attacks on Russian banks, and it is coming to a head. Now, the other aspect of this Ukraine situation is the connection to the Christopher Steele case coming out in the United States in the so-called Russiagate, that Steele was very much involved in communication with Victoria Nuland. And I think it's worth going through that, Helge, just to give people a sense that there is one enemy operation which has many tentacles.
Yes, this is directly British intelligence. It's not former MI6 agent, but it is an MI6 operation and involves the Foreign Office of Great Britain itself, as we saw in a case which was launched by one of the Russians who were accused of hacking, who took the Steele case to court, and then the British office intervened directly to block any harm or any revelations coming from the Steele operative of theirs. Now, that is an incredible story. It means the British have intervened not only in the coup against the Yanukovych government, but also in the case of the coup against President Trump. Now, that whole Russiagate is, some people funnily say, a big regurgitated nothing burger. There is absolutely no substance to it. And we should just note the fact that, the continuous investigations coming from the two houses of the Congress under the leadership of Nunes and Gressly, they are still pointing absolutely to the coup plotters who were involved with the British in this coup. Now, in the recent developments, Congressman Nunes has sent out 10 or 11 other letters to officials of the existing or former government, where they have to answer very pointed questions. When did you know first about the Steele dossier? When did you discuss it with anybody else? Did Obama know it? When did he know it? And these individuals have to answer these questions until the 2nd of March. So it's not a long-term investigation, but it's something extremely hot. And, it's not yet decided how this coup will go. If the Congress has the courage to go after those Obama intelligence officials who colluded with Great Britain. But if they do, a lot of people could not only lose their position, but actually end up in jail, as some judges are now already demanding.
Well, you brought up the relationship of this Steele dossier to the whole Russiagate story. The other part of this is that you have Obama himself now being addressed or named, as his name's coming forward, Brennan, the former CIA director, Comey, Mueller's role. And then you had Mueller come out with this indictment of these 13 so-called Russian spies on the eve of the Munich conference. And EIR is putting out a story on this. What can you tell us about what this latest fraud is?
Well, this is a case which will never be put in trial because, these are people living in Russia. It's an old case. It was already discussed in 2014. And since there is no extradition treaty between the United States and Russia, the trial will never take place, and therefore Mueller does not have to provide any evidence for his accusations. So it's a very convenient way to keep, beating the drumbeat in an anti-Russian hysteria. And, it's a big nothing burger, as people have been pointing out. But it is actually a fraud on the population, because if you keep building this kind of enemy image, like against Russia and China, when people should understand it has nothing to do with Russia hacking or Russian collusion. As a matter of fact, there was several people, but one of them was a leading member of the Russian Duma who said that there are 102 very well documented cases for the United States meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. And, it's fairly known how many coups and regime change. And, so obviously the minimum you could say is that both sides are doing it. But the United States has a very long record of having, tried to intervene in the internal affairs of other countries in multiple ways. So this should be understood as a pre-war propaganda, and people, easily fall for, things which are in the mainstream media. They should think twice. What Russia is doing and what China are doing is they're building a completely different model of international relationship, explicitly modeled on non-interference and respect for the other social system of the other country. And therefore, this propaganda is just a terribly dangerous scenario of lies, which actually is serving as a preparation for war. And that's what people really must get straight.
And on that point, the former CIA director Woolsey was asked in an interview, isn't it true that the United States is engaged in attacks on other nations' elections, and he hemmed and hawed, and then he said, well, yes, we do it, but we do it for their benefit. In other words, the U.S. is trying to overthrow governments for the benefit of the people that are under those governments. Now, you mentioned the Russian and Chinese policies, the moving ahead. There was a very interesting conference in Vienna in the last couple of days on expanding the Silk Road to Vienna as a hub. This would connect Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. Where's the rest of Europe in this?
Well, in the government treaty of the new Austrian government, there is actually a whole paragraph that the Austrian government should work and will work together with the new Silk Road perspective of China. And if you look at the German government, they say no, we should ask the EU. So if you want to be polemical about it, you could say that this time the Germans should listen to an Austrian for a change, because the Austrian policy is actually very good. This took place in the context of an international railway forum in Vienna, where an agreement was signed between the Austrian and the Russian railway to extend the broad gauge from Vienna to a little town in Slovakia, which is actually 400 kilometers, but then connects with the broad Russian gauge Vienna all the way through Russia to China. So that will be the precondition for Vienna to become actually what they have stated, a hub for the new Silk Road. And this is actually very, very good, because this will obviously have a big influence on all the neighbors in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans. So this is very good. I think that Switzerland is moving in a similar direction. Also Belgium, and Netherlands are clearly trying to cooperate with the new Silk Road. In France, there is a major motion in this direction after the state visit of President Macron earlier in January, where he really asked China to help France to not repeat the mistakes in the colonial policy in Africa, which I thought was really remarkable. And it's a clear shift in the French policy. So the only places, which really are standing out very clearly is Brussels and Berlin. Naturally, the British play, a double game as usual. On the one side, they want to make London a financial center of cooperation with China. But when Prime Minister May was recently in China, she did not sign an agreement to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think it's a very rocky process, but you have a lot of interest in the chambers of commerce. The head of the Vienna Chamber of Commerce actually said that he was extremely happy that the new Austrian government responded so quickly to the demand of industry for such a cooperation. And even in Germany, there are many local middle-level industries, chambers of commerce, who all discover that it would be in their very best interest to indeed play a leading role in this cooperation. So given the fact that the German government is having enormous troubles to be even formed, the SPD, the Social Democracy, is in a free fall. They are now in the polls at 15%. Can you imagine that? And people are extremely worried that the social democracy in Germany could have the same fate like it had in other European countries, basically vanishing. Naturally, this is not good. And, obviously there is a big revolt in the CDU against Merkel, who want to have newer members and younger people who all unfortunately are not any better than Merkel in this respect. So we are in a deep crisis. The European Union is in a crisis. We have the Italian election coming up in the first week of March, where it could very well be an ungovernable situation, like it is very difficult in Germany right now. So I think we are going to be in rocky times, and until there are enough people who are willing to think in completely new ways about a new paradigm of a win-win cooperation, to stop geopolitics, to stop the idea that you are in a zero-sum game where one is losing and the other one is winning, but that you can actually have a relationship of a win-win cooperation for a new world economic order. Until enough people are realizing that and understand that we have to leave geopolitics behind, we are in really an existential danger.
Well, Helga, when I was reading the documents coming from this Vienna conference, it reminded me of the proposal that you made at the time of the fall of the communist governments of Eastern Europe for the industrial triangle. And at that time, you specified the area between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna as the triangle from which the spiral arms of rail could go. This is the potential still. I mean, this is a blueprint for connecting with the new Silk Road, and it seems so obvious. So why is it that these governments, especially the government in Germany, is still clinging to what they know doesn't work, which is the EU policies of austerity and bailouts?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what is the motives of Mrs. Merkel is the 64 million euro question. I mean, people really don't know. I mean, I think one simple explanation is that all of these parties want to keep the status quo. You know, I mean, what has become so absolutely nakedly blatant in these discussions trying to form a coalition is that there is no content, no vision, no idea where Germany should be in 50 years from now, nothing resembling what Xi Jinping presented at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party in China in October, namely a vision until 2050. And what these negotiators of the so-called Grand Coalition, which is not so grand anymore because the numbers are shrinking, is just trying to get a post, and that has been now publicly discussed because it's obvious. And so I think what is needed is people who have a vision, people who get away from the idea that you have to defend a banking system which is just making the rich more rich and the poor more poor. Statistics are that the lower 40% of the income people in Germany in the last 20 years became significantly poorer. And you have a lot of people who have just part-time jobs and have jobs which can be cancelled without pre-warning or without an official reason. So people are in a very precarious living condition. And those people who just say we have to keep the status quo obviously are completely oblivious to even the well-being and the common good of the own population, leave alone Africa or the Middle East or other nations of the world. So I think we have an establishment which is really, in a certain sense, it reminds you of the dinosaurs. They don't want to give up the old geopolitical thinking. They don't want to recognize the fact that we are in front of another financial blowout, which could be much, much worse than the one of 2008. And, I think what is needed very urgently is a public debate about what future should the world have, what future should each country have, and how can we order the relations among our nations in such a way that mankind can have a bright future. And such a discourse is utterly absent from the mainstream media, and it is also not very well developed in any other fora.
Well, of course, you've spoken about this quite a bit, and I'd like to bring this to the whole question of what just happened in Florida with another mass shooting at a high school, where we're seeing what you're just describing, the killing of the future, the destruction of youth, not just in these kinds of massacres, but also the drug epidemic, the so-called social network phenomena, the destruction of thinking. You and the Schiller Institute have been out front on this for a long time by addressing the collapse of the culture, not just with video games and social networking, but the overall collapse. And when you talk about a dialogue, what are the elements of what should be brought in positively to move this situation from where we stand now?
Well, we just have to go back to the highest level of culture in each nation. Now, in the United States, this would obviously mean Benjamin Franklin, the founding fathers, John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Kennedy, these periods, when the United States had a positive vision about its role. When John Quincy Adams, for example, he had a foreign policy approach, which was pretty much like what China is doing today. Benjamin Franklin, was a absolute enthusiastic student of Confucius, and he used the Confucian philosophy to develop his own system of morality. I mean, these are the kinds of discussions which would really help. In Germany, we are very blessed to have a very rich culture. We had many, many thinkers, from Nikolaus of Cusa, Kepler, Leibniz. We had many composers of classical music, from Bach to Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, many others. We had fantastic poets like Schiller, Lessing, Heine, Mörike, and again, many others. And in Italy, we had the Golden Renaissance. In Spain, we had the Andalusian Renaissance. We had the Baghdad Caliphate. Baghdad used to be, in a certain period during the Abbasid dynasty, the most developed city in the world. Then you had the various centuries where China was the leading nation in terms of science and culture. So what we have to do is we have to activate the best potential of each nation, because this is about to be lost. I mean, how many pupils in the United States today read the Federalist Papers, or have the kind of imagination of building infrastructure in the way it was done in the Lincoln period, and then later again in the 20th century. People have to start constructing a vision for the future, building on the best tradition of the own nation, and then getting into an active dialogue with the other nations about it. And I'm absolutely certain that if that would be done, a new renaissance is absolutely possible. But we have to shed a lot of the present populist culture. We have to get rid of this idea of money makes money. We have to get rid of wasting our time with speculation or playing video games, or people are really losing their creative potential. But you can regain it by studying classical music, classical poetry, reading the philosophers, Plato, Cusanus, Leibniz in the original, or not commentaries, but the original works. Go back to the sources, as the humanists always have said. And then I think it would be very easy to create a new renaissance of thinking. And I think that the New World Economic Order, the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, in the final instance, will only succeed if it goes along with the renaissance of classical culture. And China is doing that. They are reviving their 5,000 years of history. I had the fortune to visit some of the places in Dunhuang, or the beautiful Buddhist excavation, or excavations nearby Chongqing, and actually many other things in the museums and so forth. So there is a tremendous effort by China to revive the best cultures, make it accessible to as many people as possible, and have a spread of Confucianism inside China in every pore of the society. And I think the West should have something similar. I think we have the thinkers, but they are not being revived and they are not being cherished. And I think that is an urgent question if we don't want to have more such horror shows like the school shooting, which I think naturally the weapons discussion is important, but more important is really the question: how do you give people the inner strength, the sense of inner beauty, that they don't go in this direction? I mean, you have many troubled people who could be absolutely saved if there would be a serious effort of an aesthetical education, an education of the moral beauty of their character, which is why you need the classics and not some modern versions of poetry and drama, because only if you have the highest idea of man as a beautiful soul, as a beautiful character, then the education system can inoculate people against such horror shows. And I would really wish that people would join with us in this effort.
Well, and I think in that light, we also have to address the drug question, the opioid epidemic, and as well the whole money laundering apparatus, which plays into not just drugs, but also terrorism. Also, in the interest of pushing this debate forward, Helga, I would recommend that people go to the Schiller Institute archives and read your writings on this, because you've given numerous speeches about how we can invigorate the process of people discovering their own creative potential. Well, I think with that, we'll end this week's webcast. And Helga, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, and I would like to invite you, our listeners, also to subscribe or register for the new class series, which is sponsored in the United States by, I think, LaRouche.
Yes.
Because this is an in-depth course where people can study the new paradigm. You did a class on geopolitics the last week, and there will be, I think, another 6 or 8 classes where people can really study these ideas in depth. So I want to definitely encourage you to do that, and then talk to you hopefully next week.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.